All right, so Will, first things first.
Yes, sir.
How did you wind up making the move from Michigan down to the South to begin working NASCAR?
Well, I actually moved south to Ohio first and had a job doing machine design work for a structural steel company that built offices and warehouses and shopping malls. And then we'll probably end up discussing about the accident that happened. That happened in Lebanon, Ohio, and I just felt like I needed to be someplace else, so I moved, and I ended up getting a job. Well, before I moved, I actually got a job with a gentleman named Howard Milliken, and I worked at Indianapolis in 1970, probably 90 days after that. A little more than 90 days after that accident, I was working in USAC for Howard Milliken, and Jigger Sorois was driving the car, and Rick Muther, a two-car Indy effort. And I actually went from there to Ray Nichols, and then was at Ray Nichols, a guy named Ron Purrier invited me to move south with him to work for Benny Parsons. And so it was at the end of 71, I think, into 70, that I moved south. When I left, I put my car on a trailer, and I looked back, and we lived on a lake, and there was a foot of snow on a frozen lake. And when I got to Ellerby, North Carolina, there were peach stands and sandbars all over the place.
What have I gotten myself into?
Well, no, I was happy. I ain't that crazy about snow. I was okay to be in the sand. Didn't offend me in any way.
Now, what were you doing with Benny?
I just was a mechanic. I
Okay.
started to work for Benny Parsons for $100 a week, working 100 hours a week. And I told my mom once, and never again. My mom wasn't a business person, but she knew how to divide 100 into 100. My salary wasn't all that smooth.
Now, how long were you with Benny?
Was Benny, I think the whole year in 1970, and then I went down to work for Joe Frazone, where John Green was the car owner, and then I was Joe Frazone's crew chief, and then I worked up to Cecil Gordon's crew chief, and while I was working with Cecil, Mario Rossi called and invited me to come to Hueytown to work with him with Donnie, and that was probably the single best move that I made.
Now, you told a story in your book about a huge wreck at Talladega where Joe broke his arm. Tell me about that incident.
That, I don't remember the date, but it had to be 72 around in there someplace. And NASCAR started 60 cars at Talladega. That was the last time they ran that many cars. And about the 10th or 11th lap, Ramo Stott, I think it was in Junie Dunleavy's car, lost a motor, and he spun. He spun down off the apron and into the infield, and the infield, for some reason, wasn't grass, so it stirred up a ton of dirt. And it made a cloud, and the wind blew that dirt cloud over the racetrack and just made the wreck worse. And we had radios, and I called Joe. I said, "Joe, are you okay?" He didn't come around, so I said, "Joe, you okay?" And I didn't hear nothing from him. And then I just heard this real loud noise, and Joe says, "That effing driver just ran into me," and one of the drivers had gone all the way around the wreck the first time.
Oh, wow.
And the second time around, spun down off the track and backed into Joe. And he backed into Joe's driver's door. And Joe says, "Yeah." He says, "We're going to need a new windshield." So he came around, and the situation is you take the clips off, take the windshield out, send him out, and go a lap so you don't get a lap down. And when he left, something didn't seem right. So I called Joe on the radio. I said, "Joe, what kind of driver's uniform you got on?" He says, "I got the union uniform. It's one they gave everybody." So it was a tan colored. But when I looked in that window, that uniform was red. So I said, "Joe, what's going on?" He said, "Just get me the effing windshield in this car." We came back in. I looked down inside there, and I could see probably 4 inches of the bone in his forearm.
Wow.
And I said, "Hey, you ain't racing this thing." He says, "Put that effing windshield in that car." And I said, "I ain't going to do it." He says, "You work for me. If you don't put that windshield in there, I'm going to come out there and kick your butt." Well, you can't put the windshield in. I said, "What if I put the windshield in? How are you going to hold on to it?" He said, "I want you to put two wraps of gray tape around my arm, and then tape my left hand to the steering wheel. I said, Joe, you're just crazy. I ain't doing it. He
That's
says,
not funny, but it's funny.
Well, today it's funny. It
Yeah.
wasn't funny then. And he wanted to go, so I went and raised the hood and reached over and pulled the coil wire out. That wasn't the best decision I ever make. That bit me pretty hard, but I said, we're shutting the motor off. He came out of that car. He was going to kick my butt. So I made my way to the infield care center. We did not make it all the way to the infield care center before he passed out on the ground.
Now, you mentioned the fact that you went to work for Dygard in the very early days of that team, and you
Yes,
said
sir.
that it was the best decision that you had made to that point. Why is that?
Well, I've always liked collecting details, so I read a book, and back over here I have probably a collection. And when I went to Donnie's, I think I had at that time about 44 books in a milk crate. I bring these books in, I'm thinking they're going to be impressed that I've read all these books. And so I asked Donnie, I said, where do you want me to put these books? And he said, over there behind the air compressor. Put a case of oil on them so they don't get blown away or something like that. I kind of knew then how that was going to go. But Rossi taught me how to think a lot of things. He always made me assign a probable cause to what was causing the problem, so I had a base from which to start to fix the issues. And Donnie and I would butt heads on occasion, but he never, ever belittled me. And I had a respect for that right off the bat. We would argue and talk, but if you know Donnie, he gets this look in his eye, and he comes up and he puts his finger in your chest and he says, I'm going to tell you what. Or, let me tell you this.
Yeah.
But I knew right from the get-go, I may not have always agreed with what Donnie said, but I always believed him. I mean, I knew that's what he thought. And he was very instrumental in making me understand when the book said oversteer, this is what it felt like. And he was the one that was instrumental in when I went off to have my own team before we had radios, in being able to identify with hand signals what the car was doing, going into the turn. So we would always want to, I would always want to know, where's your hand, which foot is on which pedal, and how hard. And by doing that, you understood if it was a problem with the front of the car or a problem with the rear of the car. It took me a long time to understand that a car that handles has to have a lot of grip on it, asphalt. And in the rear tires, that's a function of weight and the contact patch. And it's either forward motion or braking motion. But at the front, that contact patch has to be vectored into side force and forward or backward force. And so you couldn't make the same proportional decision at the front as you could at the back. And then Rossi showed me, loaned me overnight a copy of something that Larry Rathcap had made for Richard Petty, and it was a computer printout. I didn't know about computers, so I didn't know what this book was, but I did learn some things, and one of them that was, I began looking at a thing called a front roll couple distribution, and the car has a different roll center to back, different roll center to front. The mast height is the same, so there's different moment arms at the front than there is in the back. And there's a percentage involved, and I just made up my mind that drivers like a particular percentage. My opinion is it's up around 83% at the front. And I got that out of that book that Petty liked 83.3, or I'm very careful what I say there, but I learned to try to evaluate a car to learn what those roll couple figures were. And it kind of worked to my benefit. Had I come across a couple of bags of money, it might have been a different situation. But I'm appreciative of what Donnie did for me, and he stuck with me until I understood. And then at the end, I wish that had worked out better. Donnie and I got let go from Dygard, I think, within a day of each other. neither of us quite understands.
Well, I was
The
going to
reasoning.
mention, I was going to ask. There was, it seemed like there was turmoil with that team almost from day one. I understand that there was a little bit of friction between Donnie and Mario, and then Donnie and the Gardner brothers. Even at that point, even so early in that team, what do you remember about any of that, if anything?
I remember the turmoil between Donnie and Dygard. I've since learned why. I respectfully decline to discuss that. Donnie has said he'd like to deal with that. So I kind of understood what they were, so I understand what his were. I don't have a clue. They let me go a day before. I think they let Rossi go. I don't think I had any ill feelings with them.
Yeah.
I write in a story about a pit wagon that I built, and I built that. I wanted to build it, and they wouldn't give me the money to build a pit wagon. But Rossi
Yeah.
said, you go get it and give me the receipts, and he'd turn it in on his expense report. It took a piece of steel and a couple pieces of aluminum. I don't know what the deal was. That miffed me a little, but not enough to I don't think we had any problems there. And I didn't know till just recently that Donnie and Mario had issues. I remember one issue they had, but Rossi was always good to me, and I really liked working with Donnie. You could always believe what Donnie said. I don't consider myself a huge commentator on driver abilities, but I watched Donnie put that car places I saw other people weren't going. He knew what he wanted, and he would make sure you understood what he wanted. And we went fast. I mean, I miss that a lot. But the issue they had with Donnie, the only issue that I knew about Mario and Donnie was that the motor we sat on the pole in '75 for the 500 and the 400 in a Dygard car. And that motor was built by Grumpy Jenkins. And he spent some time down there. And the basis of, I've got a book that I've written, a vehicle dynamics book that's not been published, because I saw 3 valve springs in the head of this motor, and I have an idea that that's true for wheel frequencies in the chassis. But the issue was, that particular motor, Donnie had told Jenkins or Jenkins had asked Donnie to make sure nobody saw that carburetor and that intake setup. And at one point, Mario took that carburetor and intake down to Smokey's, and Donnie found out about it and tore out after him, and he walked in, worked past, I don't remember what Johnson's first name was, but that worked for Smokey, but he was a big boy, pushed past him and got into the office where Smokey and Rossi were, and said, Rossi, I told Bill we'd not show that to anybody. And I remember to this day, Smokey's respect for Donnie was such that he said, Rossi, get that out of here. That Smokey turned down an option to look at that because Donnie had given his word to Smokey, and Smokey was that respectful of Donnie that he honored that. So that gave me a lot of enthusiasm for liking Donnie Allison and Smokey. And spent a lot more time with Donnie than I did Smokey.
Now, you've mentioned Mario Rossi several times, and fans today don't really remember him. Who was the Mario Rossi that you knew? Who was he?
I just remember him being a diligent advocator of details. It just didn't make any difference how long it took. If there was a list of things that had to be done, we did it. And when I was at Dygard, I would categorize my job now as a car chief, I guess. But that would run out at dinner, and I'd come back after dinner, because Rossi was working in the engine room, and I could go out and diddle with some of the stuff and make little stuff out in the shop. But Rossi would let me, change the valve covers or, clean parts, trying to learn something, and he just was a great attention to detail, and he always kept repeating, see if you can determine It's seeing if you can assign a probable cause for your issues. I just had a great deal of respect for Rossi and Donnie, but in writing the book, somewhere in there I made a comment that as many miles as I put on that truck driving the car from racetrack to racetrack, we couldn't keep Donnie in that car for 100 miles. I didn't realize at the time. I knew we had motor problems, but I'm surprised Donnie didn't. I'm certain Donnie was disheartened at how many times we had to pull out because of a blown motor. And I know Rossi was trying. I thought Rossi was brilliant. I understood. If he told me what he was doing, I understood it. I never shared in any of his decisions, but he thought before he did something. And I think in hindsight he was so intent on going fast, he might have lost a little bit about durability. But that was his interest, was to go fast. He was a motor man, and I'm proud of my association with both Donnie and Mario.
Now, if I read your book correctly, and you've mentioned it, you and Donnie were released by DieGuard the same day, if not maybe a day apart or whatever. What happened?
You know, I do not know. Well, I initially thought I was let go because of Donnie, because while Donnie and I would butt heads, he was very respectful of my opinion. He never, you know, if he didn't agree with it, he'd just come up, put that hand in my chest and say, let me tell you this. Like I said, but I believed him. But I was always looking for answers. I really was enthused about vehicle dynamics, and we lived there in Daytona, and so one time I just called down to Cape Canaveral, and I still don't know how this happened, but I got a hold of one of them engineers. I said, hey, you got any leftover computers that would tell us what G-forces were developing in the car? And they danced around it a couple, 3 months, and the guy finally called back. He says, yeah, we got something we'd sell you. And my recollection was it was like $14,000 and weighed 60 pounds. Well, you know, and nowadays that's candy money and miserable weight. But back then, we were putting, it was 40 pounds, but we were putting 60 pounds of lead in a certain spot. So I'm thinking, this is a piece of cake. We'll take out 40 pounds of lead, put a 40-pound computer in there, and DieGuard, I don't know that I got an answer from DieGuard about the money. And but Donnie said, we ain't putting that thing in here. If we change this car, it's going to be based on what I want to put in the car. And I respected that, and I didn't think nothing about it. But then when we got let go, I thought, crap. That's all I could think of was Donnie was PO'd because I was trying to override his authority or something. But as it turns out, I learned later, Donnie got let go the next day, so it wasn't Donnie. Donnie's kind of given me his opinion, but I'll keep that, I guess.
Now, how did you wind up working for Ricky Rudd?
Humpy Wheeler. Humpy Wheeler was very, very good to me. He was instrumental in me getting started both with Ricky and with Dale. In 75, I had been working with Janet Guthrie the year before while I was working with Ralph Moody. And I wasn't a full-time employee. You know, I'd work when he had cars and stuff to work on, but at night, and I'd leave early and go home. I started my own shop in Fort Mill, and Humpy knew that. So he'd seen that Ricky was struggling a little bit, trying to work out of Virginia. So he got a hold of Al Rudd Sr., and he got us together, and we started, I don't remember, the third race of the year, I think. And it worked out really good. The thing that just impressed me the most about working with Ricky, I spent some time talking with Ricky on the phone, writing the book. We ran 25 races together. 10 of those races, which is 40% of the races that we entered, we finished in the top 10. More impressive to me, and I had to call Ricky twice to confirm this, we did it with one car. We ran 25 races with one car. And the best we ran was at Talladega, and in the book I read about this, his dad, I guess it's okay to tell you this, he said his dad bought we lost a motor, so his dad went down and bought a motor from Robert Yates. I didn't know this till later, but it was on credit. And we finished fourth in that race. I think we ran really, really well. And it turns out the paycheck for our Talladega race was $15 more than he owed Robert for the motor. So I didn't know that till I talked to
Yeah.
Ricky. I mean, I knew we
Wow.
got the motor, but I didn't
Yeah.
realize that was that close. But I'm very, very impressed. I went and did some research. We never fell out of a race because of a crash. I have one picture of the right front corner. Well, it's still in the black and gold paint scheme at Rockingham. And I looked up the records, and we lost a motor that race. We didn't crash. So my assumption was that he blew a motor and hit the wall with it. But I was very, very impressed with Ricky, too, because we ran 25 races with one car. And he shared with me the truck we pulled that thing around in was a dually truck it was a dually truck a pickup that they'd taken the back off and put a 20-foot box on the back, a 16-foot box on the back. Didn't have very good brakes. If you read the story, I bounced him out of the sleeper on the way to Nashville, and I never knew him when they called him Rooster, but I could tell he was calm and tenacious, because when I avoided a wreck by going off into the grass between the lanes of the highway over there on 40, bounced him out of the sleeper onto the seat, and he just, if you read the book, he used to call me Uncle Bud. He said, "Uncle Bud, what the hell are you doing out here in the grass?" And I said, "Look out that window." Looked out the window, and he could see that there was a wreck up there on the interstate. He just crawled back in the sleeper and went to sleep. He didn't say nothing, didn't bother him. We're still just driving in the grass area. So I was impressed. He was a pretty tough boy back then, even before they came to call him Rooster. The name of the story in the book is Rooster Tales. But
Well, I think it's impressive that you evidently think that much of him, even though he was so young into his career at that point.
also, I met Ricky before then when I was with Donnie. At some point we were at Martinsville, did really, really well, and we're running real good, but we were running out of brakes. And then he ran into somebody. We came in and we found out that he'd lost his brake pads for some reason. And he said, "That number 10 car just backed into me." Well, he didn't back into him. Donnie ran into him. But after the race, when the drivers pulled in, the number 10 car pulled up next to us while we were loading our car. And coming out of that car, I write in the book, was a size 28 boy in a size 40 driving uniform. He had got in Bill Champion's car in the middle of the race. Bill Champion had sponsored him in some go-karts and maybe some local stuff. And without telling anybody, NASCAR or anybody, Ricky just went and got one of Bill's old driver's uniform and got on and relieved Bill Champion in a NASCAR race. NASCAR didn't know it was him, didn't know it was a kid or nothing. He drove that race and drove pretty good, I thought.
You mentioned an accident earlier, and I didn't exactly know how I was going to bring it up, but Greg Heller is not a name that's familiar to a lot of NASCAR people, but he did run a couple of races
Yes, sir.
in the late 1970s, and he became a close friend of yours.
Extremely close.
You two had this bond
Yeah.
that was really forged out of some incredible tragedies. Tell me about your friendship with Greg.
Well, it's a little difficult to talk about, but we were talking one day at Charlotte about something. He'd been driving our car, and somehow he had heard that I'd lost my family and two little girls in a car wreck, and we just were talking about it, and he said that he had lost a daughter. He'd lost a daughter to cancer, and later on, we just had this gut feeling between each other when something occurred in our life, the other one was there. And later, he had a boy get killed because he ran into a guy wire to a telephone pole, and it killed him. And he told me about it, and in the morning, he was in Du Bois, Pennsylvania. In the morning, I was on his porch, and when my dad died, he surprised me being at the funeral, and we just have this bond that people I think maybe that haven't lost children understand. You just I don't know. We just many things we liked each other. He was the first grown man that I ever told that I loved. Because he said that to me first, and I don't know. We just have this terribly close bond, but we don't hang out. It's just amazing. It just seems like it takes like a tragedy for us to get together, but he's been right there. And because of what happened to his boy, I was up there one time, and his dad called us into his office. His dad, Cletus, was just really good to me. And he said, and he wanted Greg to quit racing because he was kind of losing family members, you know, and he said he didn't want something to happen to him. So they said, so Cletus said, Greg, Greg said, if you want me to quit racing, what do you want me to do with all our stuff? And he says, well, why don't we give that to your friend in South Carolina? And they gave me his race car, a spare motor. He owned a spring company, so I probably got way over 100 springs, gears, wheels and tires and sway bars. He just gave me a multitude of things to continue my career. And he gave it to me.
Gave it to you.
Absolutely gave it to me.
Wow.
I don't have the words to thank that guy.